Hey, and welcome to another video from our Diversity and Inclusion Short Input series. My name is ninakiel, and I'm Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Flying Sheep Studios in Cologne. In case you've missed the introductory video on why you should care about diversity and inclusion, especially if you are a CEO, please make sure to check it out first. You'll find the link in the description below. Now, today we'll focus on another topic that my team repeatedly asked to be covered. And that's probably because it's about a concept which has been more widely discussed in recent years, but still it's kind of difficult to grasp. So today we're talking about tone policing. Now, let's first start with the definition, or actually two definitions, because they each cover different nuances of this phenomenon. So according to dictionary.com, tone policing is a conversational tactic that dismisses the ideas being communicated when they are perceived to be delivered in an angry, frustrated, sad, fearful, or otherwise emotionally charged manner. And the Wikipedia, meanwhile, defines the concept of tone policing as follows. Tone policing is a type of ad hominem aimed at the tone of an argument instead of its factual or logical content in order to dismiss a person's argument. To briefly explain this part, an ad hominem argument is a rhetorical strategy where the speaker attacks the character, the motivation, or some other attribute of their conversational partner instead of the substance of their argument. So essentially, this is a personal attack that is used to discredit the other person and distract from the topic at hand. What I'd like to point out right away is that most definitions of tone policing, including these two, assume intent of another person. It is assumed to be a strategy employed on purpose to silence other people, but actually many people do it without even noticing. And there are several reasons for that, but I'll talk about them in a moment. Let's first focus on what tone policing actually entails and how it can affect both individuals as well as entire movements. So let's imagine that someone points out a matter of injustice, for example, the underrepresentation of women in executive jobs, as you can see here. And instead of responding to their arguments, another person then says, well, that is an important issue to discuss, but I think you'd reach more people if you weren't that aggressive. Or maybe they say, you should calm down so we can discuss this like adults. So as you can see, tone policing can come in very different shapes and forms. And in some cases, the responses are meant as sincere advice. And in other cases, they're really intended to silence people. That's the point of intent. And what these responses have in common is that they focus on the delivery instead of the content of a message. And that's very important. They seek to invalidate arguments because a person is, to some extent, emotional. It's actually very common to this day to assume that someone who's experiencing and expressing emotions cannot be rational. It's essentially brain versus heart, right? And this particular tone argument disproportionately affects women, who are often painted as being controlled by their emotions and not capable of clear, rational thinking. But this is actually a logical fallacy because a person can absolutely be angry or sad while still being rational, because rationality essentially means having reason or understanding. So at its core, tone policing suggests that people distance themselves from their own emotions in order to be heard. But that's really difficult, if not impossible, for people who are constantly affected by injustice and discrimination to meet that expectation. And also these emotions they are feeling are often central to the issue that is being discussed, especially when trying to explain how certain structural problems affect people on an individual level, which is key to understanding why certain issues need to be addressed. And this way of addressing issues absolutely involve emotions. So a core part of tone policing is that it allows privileged people to define the terms of a conversation in order for that conversation to continue. That means marginalized people have the choice to either try to meet these terms or waive the opportunity to discuss an important topic altogether. And very often the motivation behind this conversation strategy, whether it's used intentionally or not, is derailing a conversation because a person feels uncomfortable. And they suggest that it's not because of the topic itself, which is most often the case, but due to the way that the information is conveyed. Again, the tone of the conversation. To quote Dr. Janice Gassam-Asare, who is a DEI consultant, the underlying tone in these messages is that even in speaking about my experiences with racism, microaggressions, and discrimination, there is a right way and a wrong way to share. I am told that if I modify my message to be more palatable to the masses, my message will be better received. This demonstrates that people will dismiss your experiences unless it fits in the box of how they want to receive it. So there are two important layers in this kind of messaging. First, people who give this kind of feedback assume they know better. So they give unsolicited advice to someone whose daily struggles they likely never experienced themselves and fail to understand because of it. And second, as I already mentioned, they also ask people affected by serious problems to discuss them in a more easily digestible fashion because they don't want to be bothered more than absolutely necessary. And again, the processes leading to this kind of behavior can absolutely be unconscious ones. So for example, we might have been taught that women in particular should not be aggressive. And so we reproduce this kind of social script unwittingly. Or perhaps we feel uncomfortable or even attacked in a discussion, so we try to diffuse the situation by asking the other person to be less aggressive. And honestly, that's an understandable immediate reaction. But it's important that you do the work and ask yourself if this reaction is actually appropriate or if there are better options. And I will give you some advice on that at the end of this talk, by the way. But first, we also need to discuss the other dimension of tone policing. And that is using it on purpose to discredit individuals or even entire political movements by hyper-focusing on aggressive or over-emotional behavior of individuals from that movement. A classic example of that would be the angry feminist, which has even been turned into a meme. And what I'd like to point out is that when you watch the actual footage that this still has been taken from, this person actually does not appear nearly as aggressive as this still suggests, and she even cites statistics. But the situation in which she found herself did not allow for a calm discussion. It was actually a political protest where Trump supporters and counter-protesters clashed. And people just kept shouting at each other. And someone who shouts looks and sounds more aggressive by default, right? That's very important to keep in mind. But most people don't know that because they didn't watch the original footage. And what stuck was the cliché of the hyper-aggressive feminist who gets triggered easily. Especially when it's done deliberately, the problem of tone policing is that the goalpost of civilized conversation keeps being moved until people have no way to speak up anymore. So the goal gets smaller and smaller. A good example would be the Black Lives Matter protests, which started after George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. There was a continued narrative that the protesters could get their message across if only they were protesting in the right way, meaning calmly, rationally, quietly. But when footballer Colin Kaepernick, who you can see on the right side here, just kneeled down in silence to protest police brutality, he was also met with heavy criticism, because he reminded people of a very uncomfortable truth, that there's systemic racism in the US and around the world. So there is simply no way to make certain issues palatable or digestible, because people who are actively trying to ignore these issues will always feel uncomfortable when they're reminded that these issues exist. And very importantly, that they themselves might be part of the problem. So that means the mere mention of certain topics is considered to be uncivil or rude. The strategy is commonly used by right-wing politicians and activists who claim that particular topics or even certain terms are inherently loaded with emotion and used to attack white people. So the goalpost is moved from try to be calm to I won't allow you to use certain words, as we can see here in the example of Elon Musk, who framed certain terminology, medical terminology, as slurs. And once we're at the point where just the mention of this terminology, and especially professional terminology, leads to people being too uncomfortable to engage with and allow a conversation, there's really no way to discuss a topic anymore. It's impossible to reach the goalpost. Now, that being said, I want to stress that the goalpost also shouldn't be moved so that everything goes, right? While people who have been personally or historically oppressed have every right to be angry, having lived experience or being knowledgeable about systemic issues doesn't give a person the right to attack everyone around them. There's a difference between being angry and actively hostile. And this is where I'd like to try to make a distinction between tone policing and moderating. So if a person is constantly attacking people, maybe even using ad hominem arguments themselves, then their right to speak in a community might be revoked, and rightfully so, because in this instance, asking someone to change their tone is not an attempt to silence them, but to allow the conversation in this community to continue, because otherwise people might not feel safe anymore to share their opinions. And the same is true in real-world conversations, like in everyday conversations, encounters at the office. You don't have to accept being verbally attacked or insulted. There's definitely a line to be drawn. And ultimately, it's up to you to decide where you want to draw that line. So no matter if you're actively being attacked or just don't feel comfortable, usually you have the option to remove yourself from a conversation if you don't want to engage in it. I just want you to be aware that being able to leave a conversation, being able to leave the topic, an issue behind, is a privilege. It's a privilege of not learning about and not dealing with certain issues. And it's a luxury that people affected by these issues do not have, because they have to deal with them on a daily basis. You cannot escape racism. You cannot escape sexism. You cannot escape transphobia, and so on. So depending on the situation, perhaps you could at least offer to take a step back and take some time to think about the topic you've been discussing. Or you could do some research, because chances are that you'll be able to understand the other person and their feelings much better once you've done that, once you've familiarized yourself with the topic. And even without doing proper research, you can change your perspective and be more understanding. So try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and consider what they might have gone through until this point in their lives. How often they've been, for example, targets of racism in its various forms. Think how often they already had to explain the same concepts to other people and how draining this can be. And then consider how you'd feel in their place and how you would be able to fulfill your own expectations of a calm and civilized discussion. Because chances are that you would also be emotional, angry, and or sad in their position. But if you are in a better position to look at an issue calmly and rationally, just because you're not affected by it, then first try to live up to your own expectations instead of making demands. So ask questions, provide arguments calmly, respond to the content of the conversation instead of the tone. And then there's a really good chance your discussion partner will acknowledge that. They will notice that you are open to their arguments and take them seriously. And this then could help them calm down. So to conclude, I would suggest that you observe your own behavior in conversations and also step in if you witness a coworker or someone else being silenced, even if it's not on purpose. And stepping in means that you make the person who is doing the tone policing aware of this issue. You can tell them what you learned in this presentation. You can ask them to take a step back and think about their feelings and reasons to act like they do. And then maybe consider postponing the discussion depending on how everyone feels, because it might not be particularly productive to continue if people are really angry or hurt. Now again, as per usual, this is a complex topic and there are no easy answers or clear instructions I could provide you. But I hope that this overview at least helped you to understand tone policing a bit better and to try avoid it in the future. Thank you so much for watching, as always. See you in the next video. Bye bye.